In 1997, the world was in shock. A beloved Princess Diana was gone, and grief swept across the United Kingdom like a wave. People gathered in silence outside Buckingham Palace, laying flowers, lighting candles, and clinging to each other in disbelief. Everywhere you looked, sorrow, mourning, and questions. But one voice was missing. The Queen said nothing. For 7 long days, the most powerful woman in the country remained silent. No speech, no message to the public, nothing. The nation waited, heartbroken, confused. Was she indifferent? Was she cold? Or was something else happening behind those palace walls? Today, we finally understand the reason behind that silence. Because deep within the Queen's private writings, a story begins to emerge, one of duty, heartbreak, and the impossible choices made in those days. This is what we discovered, and once you hear it, you may never see her the same way again. It was the early hours of August 31st, 1997. News broke from Paris. Princess Diana had been in a terrible car crash. Within moments, the whispers turned into headlines, and then the unthinkable. She was gone. The world changed that morning. In London, people woke up to grief. Strangers hugged in the streets. Grown men cried openly. Radios played solemn music. Television screens showed only one face, Diana's. But while the country mourned in the open, the Queen was far from the capital. Queen Elizabeth stayed with her family at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, including her grandsons William and Harry. They were just 15 and 12 years old, and their mother had just died. The Queen kept them close, shielded from the cameras, the noise, and the weight of a nation's sorrow. She stayed behind those gates. No statements, no public appearances. But outside the palace, things were very different. The gates of Buckingham Palace turned into a sea of flowers, thousands, then millions of bouquets, photographs, letters, teddy bears, candles. The people were gathering and they were waiting. One day passed, then another, and still silence. Where was the Queen? Why wasn't she saying anything? And why? Did it feel like the monarchy had turned its back on the people just when they needed it most? As the days passed, something began to shift. The people's quiet sorrow turned into frustration, and then anger. Television presenters started asking the question out loud: why haven't we heard from the Queen? Once respectful and restrained radio hosts now voiced what millions were thinking. Does the monarchy even care? Outside Buckingham Palace, the mountain of flowers kept growing, but so did the tension. Some mourners wept quietly, others stood silently, staring at the balcony above, waiting for someone to appear, and then signs began to appear among the tributes. Where is our Queen? Speak to us, ma'am. Your people are suffering. The headlines mirrored the public mood. Show us you care, screamed one. The silence is deafening, said another. We need to hear her voice, pleaded a third. Even longtime supporters of the monarchy were beginning to doubt. Day after day, the national mood became more volatile. Phone lines at the BBC were flooded with complaints. Letters poured into newspapers. People weren't just grieving Diana. They were questioning the very heart of the royal family. The monarchy, so often above politics, above emotion, now seemed painfully out of touch. And in those days of silence, the damage was being done. Polls showed public trust in the royals dropping sharply. For the first time in decades, the question was no longer whispered. It was shouted, do we still need a queen? And all the while, inside Balmoral, the silence continued. Only later would the public begin to understand what had truly been happening behind the stone walls of Balmoral. Behind that silence wasn't indifference, but family. And even in moments of grief, life continued. Meals were shared, memories held together. And while we often imagine royal life as all gold plates and fine dining, the truth is, family always comes first. Even in the palace, everyday meals are often simple and comforting. Did you know that when Prince William and Harry were little, one of their favorite meals was mac and cheese? That stayed with me. So I decided to create a cookbook inspired by the food traditions of European royal families. It's called Elegant Main Dishes and includes festive meals and cozy dishes. Yes, including the royal mac and cheese. If you'd like to bring a taste of that royal comfort into your home, the book is available now on Amazon. in both Kindle and hardcover versions. The link is below. Now let's go back to Balmoral. While the world demanded a queen, Elizabeth chose first and foremost to be a grandmother. Inside that quiet Scottish estate, two young boys were grieving the unimaginable. Their mother had gone in a flash, and their faces were now on every front page. And the queen, a woman who had spent her life putting duty before all else, made a rare and private decision to shield William and Harry from the storm. For those 7 days, she stayed by their side, helping them eat, sleep, and breathe through their grief. There were no cameras, no statements, no grand gestures, only family. According to those close to the palace, this wasn't an act of coldness, it was an act of protection. Balmoral, often seen as a retreat for the royal family, had become a refuge from trauma. The Queen's advisors were split. Some pushed for a public statement, others urged caution, but one voice, louder than the rest, stood firm. The boys must come first. It was a choice that defied traditions and infuriated the nation. But on September 5th, everything changed. That morning, the Queen finally appeared at the gates of Buckingham Palace. The flowers were everywhere, spilling out onto the streets stacked knee-high. And for the first time, she stood before the sea of grief and looked down. She studied the cards, the portraits, the notes, the pain. The cameras rolled, the world watched. And in that moment, just by standing there, something shifted. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't even a word, but it was the beginning of something the country had been waiting for, a sign that the Queen had heard them, and that she too was mourning. That evening, as millions sat in silence in front of their televisions, the screen faded to the royal crest. And then the Queen, dressed in black, standing against a neutral backdrop inside Buckingham Palace, her face composed but her eyes more tired than usual. When she spoke, her voice was steady but softer than the public was used to.
So what I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. Since last Sunday's dreadful news, we have seen throughout Britain and around the world an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death.
It was just one sentence, but it changed everything. She spoke of Diana with warmth and sorrow. She called her an exceptional and gifted human being. She praised her for her energy, dedication, and love for her two sons. Most of all, she acknowledged the pain her death had caused, not just for the family, but for the entire nation. It wasn't a long speech, it wasn't emotional in the way some had hoped, but it was enough. For many, this was the moment the monarchy caught up with its people, if only for a moment. The distance between crown and country felt a little smaller. Behind the scenes, we now know this message almost didn't happen. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair later admitted that it took hours of discussion to convince the Queen to speak. He feared the damage to the monarchy could be permanent if she remained silent any longer. But for Elizabeth, this was never just about public image. It was about timing, about dignity, about finding a way to speak without unraveling. And when she finally did, the effect was immediate. The tide began to turn. The same papers that had once questioned her compassion now ran headlines calling her speech moving, reassuring, and necessary. It was not just a statement, it was a turning point, a quiet, carefully measured moment that began the long healing process. For years, we knew only what the cameras showed us, a single speech, a bowed head, a return to London. But behind the public image, there were private words, and only recently did the world discover them. 6 days after Princess Diana's funeral, Queen Elizabeth wrote a letter. It wasn't meant for the newspapers or the cameras. It was addressed to one of her most trusted confidants, Lady Henriette Smith, a lady-in-waiting she had known for decades. The letter, typed with a handwritten postscript, reveals something we had not seen during those 7 days of silence, the Queen's personal grief. It was indeed dreadfully sad, she wrote. She is a huge loss to the country. But what followed was perhaps even more telling. William and Harry have been so brave, and I am very proud of them. In just a few sentences, Elizabeth said what many had been wondering. She wasn't distant. She was devastated. And more than anything, she was focused on her grandsons. In her own handwriting, she added one final line, Your letter was one of the first I opened. Emotions are still so mixed up, but we have all been through a very bad experience. Those words, a very bad experience, sound almost simple, but royal historians and handwriting experts alike agree. For a monarch so famously reserved, it was an extraordinary admission of emotional chaos. An exclamation mark, rare in her private correspondence, hinted at just how shaken she had been. And this wasn't just about Diana's death. It was about the week that followed, the backlash, the pressure, the fear of losing the nation's trust, the flag that wouldn't lower, and the public demanding emotion from a queen who had never been taught to show it. According to Prime Minister Tony Blair, the Queen had hesitated to make a speech. He and other senior officials spent hours persuading her that the people needed to hear from her not as a sovereign but as a grandmother. Only now, with the letter in hand, can we understand what was happening inside those palace walls. While the country demanded a symbol, Elizabeth tried to hold a broken family together. While the headlines accused her of being cold, she was comforting two boys who had lost their mother. And in those few quiet lines written to a trusted friend, she admitted what she could never say on television, that this wasn't just a national tragedy, it was a deeply personal one. To understand Queen Elizabeth's silence, we must understand the woman behind the crown, not as a symbol, but as a person shaped by a different time. Elizabeth was born into a world where emotion was something to be mastered, not expressed. From childhood, she was taught one lesson above all: duty comes first. Her father, King George VI, was a shy and private man. He never expected to wear the crown, but when history demanded it, he obeyed without question. In public, he was steady, reserved, dependable. Behind closed doors, he suffered from crippling anxiety, but he never let the nation see it. That became Elizabeth's model for leadership: calm above all, no tears, no outbursts, no visible cracks. So when tragedy struck, when the princess once called the people's darling died in a Paris tunnel, the queen's instinct wasn't to weep with the public. It was to retreat, protect, and endure. She believed the nation needed strength, and in her mind, strength meant silence. To grieve in public would have felt like weakness. To show emotion on television, unthinkable. But this time, the old rulebook didn't work. The country wasn't looking for a monarch, it was looking for a human. They didn't want to see tradition, they wanted to see pain, to feel that the person on the throne was mourning with them. And that's where the distance grew. The queen had always believed that the crown should rise above emotion, that stability meant restraint, and that composure was leadership. But in the days after Diana's death, she learned something else, something the monarchy had never truly faced before. Sometimes even a sovereign must step down from the pedestal and simply be a grandmother. We learned even more about the Queen's silence from a secret diary. It was a collection of notes she kept for years. They stayed hidden until after her death. But before we go on, let's stop for a moment. There is something important for all of us: our health. In her later years, the Queen took good care of hers. She lived a long and steady life. Many say it was because she followed routines. She managed stress quietly. I've also learned one thing: it helps to understand how you feel. That's why I use an app called Heartscape. It works as a heart rate monitor and stress tracker. I simply place my finger over the iPhone camera, and within seconds it measures my pulse and shows detailed health patterns, including energy, stress level, and daily readiness. It also indicates health patterns over time, helping me see what's improving and what needs attention. You can download Heartscape now from the App Store. Just follow the link under this video. Twice a week, deep within Buckingham Palace, a retired footman sits in silence, sorting through the private writings of Queen Elizabeth II. His name is Paul Wybrew, known affectionately as Tall Paul, and he was one of the Queen's most trusted aides. Now, by order of King Charles, he is responsible for reviewing everything the late Queen left behind: letters, personal reflections, and decades of handwritten notes. He is quite literally the keeper of her secrets. Insiders say Charles knows there are bombs waiting in those pages. Not just reflections on royal duties, but personal thoughts about the family, the kind that could shake the monarchy if ever revealed. The royal family has a long tradition of destroying such documents before they reach the archives. Queen Victoria's daughter delayed the release of her mother's rewritten journals for 30 years. Princess Margaret burned some of the Queen Mother's most sensitive letters, and now some believe Charles might be tempted to do the same, to protect his mother's legacy and his own. But before anything disappears, some revelations have already come to light. Unlike Queen Victoria's exhaustive entries, Elizabeth's diary was brief, 10 to 15 minutes a day, just enough to mark the most joyful and most difficult moments: Christmases, births, coronations, but also arguments, betrayals, shame. Many of those entries focused on the people she loved most, and the ones who caused her the most pain: Charles, Diana, Harry, Meghan, Andrew, even Kate. She wrote in disappointment about Charles. When he admitted in 1994 that he had been unfaithful to Diana, the Queen was stunned. In a leaked conversation with the Queen Mother, she said, "It's always a mistake to speak about your marriage in public." She allowed the divorce, but the diary reveals she never truly forgave him. Andrew was even harder to accept. His association with Jeffrey Epstein, the man at the center of one of the most horrifying scandals of our time, left her traumatized. Andrew had always been her favorite. When Harry and Meghan left the firm, it hit her deeply. She loved Harry and she liked Meghan, but she believed they had rushed into marriage too quickly. In her diary, she reportedly struggled with the feeling that Harry had been influenced and lost. Even Kate wasn't above doubt. While the public believed they had a warm relationship from the beginning, the Queen's early impressions were more cautious. She reportedly viewed Kate's decision to take a gap year before university to join St. Andrews at the same time as William as calculated. It wasn't until Kate gave birth to Prince George that the Queen finally wrote that she trusted her and believed Kate would do anything to protect the monarchy's future. But above all, one name appears more than any other: Diana. Multiple sources say the Queen returned to that week in 1997 repeatedly. That silence, that distance, that choice to stay in Balmoral while the country mourned. And every time it came with the same phrase, written in her own hand. It was a very bad experience. It may sound simple, but for Elizabeth, a woman trained never to show emotion, those words meant everything, and for someone who rarely used exclamation marks, her inclusion of one was telling. This wasn't protocol, this was pain. Her former private secretary later confirmed what many suspected. The Queen's greatest regret wasn't speaking sooner after Diana's death. In those quiet lines written late at night, often with no one watching, she admitted what the public never fully knew, that she had tried to be strong, and in doing so she had become distant. The silence of 1997 left a scar, not only on the nation, but on the Queen herself. She had spent her life believing that restraint was strength. A monarch should not be led by emotion, but by duty. But after Diana's death, something shifted. The public had demanded a connection, not a crown. At that moment, Elizabeth realized that dignified silence could also be misread as indifference. It changed her. In the years that followed, the Queen began to show a more personal side in public. She spoke more often from the heart, not just from the throne. Her speeches became warmer and more human. Her appearances became more emotionally aware. She visited victims of tragedy not only as a sovereign but also as a woman, and the nation noticed. Behind the palace walls, the shift was even more significant. Royal communication, once slow, formal, and impenetrable, began to evolve. Press offices became more responsive and statements were released faster. Protocol remained, but it now had to answer to public feeling. For the first time in decades, the monarchy had to adapt. It had to learn how to feel, or at least how to show that it could. And over time, the rift with the people began to heal. Slowly, quietly, the Queen's approval ratings recovered. The tributes returned. Respect was restored. But something had changed forever. There was now an invisible line, a fragile understanding between the crown and the people it served. It was a reminder that behind every ritual and tradition stands a person, one who can be loved or judged. And for the Queen, that week in 1997 remained a lesson, one that no royal handbook had ever prepared her for. The monarchy endured, but the silence was never forgotten. Today, we look back at those 7 silent days as a crisis and a turning point. For Queen Elizabeth, it was a moment of reckoning, a moment when centuries of tradition collided with a modern world demanding emotion, vulnerability, and connection. And for perhaps the first time in her reign, the Queen had to face a truth no monarch wants to admit. That duty alone is not always enough. Her silence after Diana's death was never truly about coldness. It was about caution, fear, and the belief that the crown must not bend, even under the weight of grief. But history remembers feelings more than formality, and in the end it was the Queen's quiet regret, hidden in private letters and guarded diary pages, that revealed her most human side. She never apologized out loud. She never had to. Her actions in the years that followed spoke for her. But the question still lingers. If she had spoken sooner, would we remember that week differently? What do you think? Was the Queen right to stay silent, or was it her greatest mistake? Let me know in the comments. And if this story moved you, give it a like, subscribe for more royal history, and thank you for watching.